Well, I'm Damian Croker, founder and CEO of LexTech, and I'd like to welcome you to the first in a series of talks on IP protection. I'm here with my colleague, John Pryor, and over the coming weeks and months, we're going to be talking and interviewing some very interesting people, various aspects of IP protection. Today, we're talking with Donal O'Connell, who's going to talk what is probably fundamental to IP protection, and that's actually knowing what it is, what IP is. So I'm not going to say too much about Donal because he's going to introduce himself. He's now going to take you through about IP education, and then we'll be asking him some searching questions afterwards. Over to you, Donal.
Thanks, Damien. Hi, John. My name is Donal O'Connell. I'm Managing Director of Chorlton Innovation Services, a company that focuses on IP education, consultancy, and IP solutions and tools. Previously, I was Director of IP at Nokia, and I teach at Imperial and a few other places as well, and write regularly about IP. So thank you for having me here today.
Thanks very much for joining us, Donald. So we understand that you've just conducted quite an exhaustive survey across various organizations, sizes and types of business. And you're just putting together the conclusions. So we're really lucky today, really fortunate today to get a sort of sneak preview, an insight into what the results of this survey actually were. Could you just give us a heads up as to what the survey was?
So the survey asked a comprehensive set of questions about various aspects of IP education and training. We had over 160 participating companies and firms. About half were on the need side, so these were entities interested in receiving IP education, and about half were entities who deliver IP education of one sort or another. We had been prompted to conduct a survey because a few colleagues of mine and myself had this gut feeling that things weren't well in the area of IP education, but we felt we needed to have more data to support our position. So we felt a survey would be a good start to really understand what others think of this issue and so forth. So we felt a survey was would put good foundations in place. So where we are at the moment, the survey results and a overview report have just been shared with the participants. So we're now in the coming weeks expecting feedback from each of the participants once they get a chance to digest the findings. We ourselves are continuing to analyze the data, get individual questions to really learn what we can from this feedback, but also cross-reference and compare and contrast different questions and answers to see if there's consistency, if there's fundamental differences, for example, between smaller companies, larger companies, different industry sectors, different locations, etc., etc. So in the coming weeks, we'll be providing additional information. We'll probably conduct a webinar early in the new year to present the findings, and then a more detailed, comprehensive report will be published, hopefully before the end of the first half of 2022.
Right. Donald, just a quick one just came to my mind. Clearly, the three of us on the call here from LexTech and from your business are very interested in IP education. But I guess to some people we're biased. Why do you think IP education is important? And what's your sort of understanding of what's out there at the moment?
Well, if we start with a fundamental definition, I mean, IP is, according to the World Intellectual Property Office's creations of the mind. So it's about people. It's a management system for innovation and creativity. So if you believe, or if you want your company to be innovative and creative and be successful in that regard, you've got to take IP seriously. And innovation and creativity, again, comes from individuals, teams, groups, being led by managers and leaders and so forth. So there's a very strong connection between the individual, be it an individual contributor, manager, director, and officer, and IP. And just like any other thing in life, the more you understand it and appreciate it, probably the better you are at it. So, I mean, you wouldn't expect me to go into a finance or accounting department in a company and start doing things unless I had some fundamental understanding of what's the basics of accounting and finance. Or you wouldn't expect me to go into a sourcing and procurement department in a company and start buying and selling or whatever, and managing relationship with suppliers, unless I had at least a good understanding of what are the basics, what are the rules of how you do this well. And if you're going to be good at innovation and creativity, and protect the output of your innovation and creativity, you need to have a good understanding about IP, and therefore education is key. And unfortunately, IP is complex, so it's not something you're going to pick up watching a 30-second video on YouTube. You have to really give some thought about what is it, what are the different forms, the different processes, the different models, how am I going to use IP to my advantage, and how am I going to make sure it adds value, and how am I going to make sure I avoid the risks. So education, I think, is fundamental. But unfortunately, as one of my colleagues said recently when we were going through some of the data from the survey, it's a stain on the conscience of the IP community at the moment, because things are not well in the area of IP education.
It's broader than that, isn't it? I mean, I recall I mean, you've worked in business schools and universities in terms of educating previously, in my experience. But you also did a survey amongst business schools, did you? Or you looked at
well, first of all, there was a published report by some people in the IP community in the US, where they examined the various business schools and MBA courses in the US to see how many of them were including IP on the curriculum, and the nature of the IP modules or electives in those courses. And the findings were quite shocking, that many business MBA courses in the US were not including IP at all. A few were doing it well, but many were doing it very poorly, very little coverage given, or no coverage at all. I know from talking to my colleagues here in Europe who are involved in teaching at MBA courses and so forth. I teach at one, IP is rarely covered, and it's often just an optional elective. So we have generations of MBA students coming out who have no appreciation of what IP is all about. And that's just MBA students. If you go to engineering colleges or medical colleges and so forth, again, the same thing applies, that very few of them get exposed to IP.
So what do you think's been the consequence of this lack of education?
Obviously, the obvious thing is that a lot of people just don't understand it, or worse still, a lot of people have the wrong understanding, so they make mistakes. I mean, you see, just if you look at press articles where people, where there's a story about that has some IP aspect to it, you see things, crazy things like, well, you know, I should trademark my invention, or I think I'll patent my book or whatever. So you see just complete misunderstandings about how IP is, what it's all about and so forth. So you have a group of people who just don't understand it at all, and then you've got a group of people who have the wrong impressions, which is even worse. And so it's, and of course IP is a management system for innovation and creativity. So if you're going to be successful at innovation and creativity, and we want our businesses to be so, then you need to understand how to play this game of IP, and how to ensure IP adds value, and how you avoid the risks associated with IP. And sorry.
Yeah, do you feel there's been some financial consequences? I mean, we hear stories of businesses launching and not registering a trademark or the domain name and so on. I guess if people were more educated, these sort of things wouldn't happen.
Well, you see it in a number of ways. You see, if you talk to, let's say, innovative startups who are going through an investment round, a number of them falling flat in their face when they go present to investors, because they're not capable of telling an IP story when challenged by potential investors. I know from talking to tech transfer offices in various universities, again, they see problems with some researchers who develop some technology but go to present it to either a larger company interested in licensing or buying the technology, and running into problems when challenged about the IP aspects of their output. I've seen research, Dragon's Den obviously is a program here in the UK where people pitch to get some investing. And I've seen that there was a report published by the BBC, I think it's the BBC program, where they examined those companies that were actually promised investment by on the program, but then in the subsequent weeks or months did not actually succeed in getting the investment from the dragons. And one of the reasons given is that when the dragons did their due diligence, they discovered that what statements the company had made about ownership of the IP wasn't true at all, and issues regarding the IP caused the dragons to sort of walk away. So there were other reasons as well, but IP was one of the key reasons why. So we see it at university startups and spin-outs and tech transfer. We see it from anecdotal information from investors, and then of course just look at companies that run into IP disputes and causes disruption to the business when they suddenly realize, oh my god, I didn't realize that I can't start using this name in France, or I can't use this material, whatever, because I don't have the appropriate IP rights to go with it or whatever. So I think we see
it has
problems
consequences around raising money, even protecting your company and losing your company as well. The lack of education.
Yep.
That's a great question. Thanks, Damian. Donald, you mentioned, I was intrigued by you used the phrase, the game of IP. Most people won't consider IP as a game. They'll think of it purely in terms of protection. What do you mean quickly in terms of the game of IP?
Well, I like the game of chess. I'm not very good at it, but I do like the game of chess. I like playing it with my kids. And if you think about the game of chess, you've got different pieces that you've got to move around the board, and you've got a 8x8 matrix and so forth. So if you think about IP, well, first of all, you have individual pieces or assets, patents, trademarks, design, copyright, etc., etc. And you've got to understand what each of these pieces are all about and how you can move them and what things you can do with them and what things you can't do with them. Then you've got the board, which is your ecosystem, the environment in which you operate. There's you, your suppliers, your partners, your collaboration partners, your competitors, startups, complete unknowns. So I see IP like a game, but chess is complex, but IP is much more complex. You have a lot more pieces. The rules of the game change every so often, whereas chess tends to be fairly stable. So you've got to understand that you're playing this game. You've got these pieces, and you've got to understand what value do each of these pieces bring you. What are the things they can't do? Of course, the other party has also got IP, so they're also moving their pieces around, and you've got to understand, how am I going to play this game of IP to ensure it adds value to my business? But I do see it very much like a game. But please don't misunderstand. It's a much more complex game than chess.
So we're coming to the end. We're coming to the end now. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish?
Well, just some key points out of the survey. We definitely have to improve our approach to IP education. Not enough of the people who are delivering IP education have actually been trained how to be good teachers. And there's a skill set required to be able to teach. Many of us have discovered this during lockdown, when we're suddenly teaching our kids at home and suddenly frustrated by how difficult it is to teach addition and subtraction and English and so forth. So we understand that there's a skill set, and I think the IP community needs to understand that perhaps more of us need to be taught about how to be good teachers. Secondly, the IP community is made up of specialists rather than generalists, and too many times we see when we examine the training programs that it's highly influenced by the skill set of the teacher. So if you're a patent attorney, your training tends to be on patents. If you're a trademark attorney, your training tends to be on trademarks. But of course, the audience wants to be trained on IP, and IP is quite broad. So it's not just the forms, it's the different processes, it's the different IP models, it's the role of the different entities. So you have to have a much broader approach to explaining IP, and that requires presents challenges to these specialists. And then fundamental things like preparing well in advance before you deliver the training, follow-up. Too many times we saw in the training that the training is delivered and then there's no follow-up in the days, weeks and months afterwards. Well, how do you know that the people got what you were presenting? So there's some basics that need to be done as well, and need to be done well. So I would say teaching, skills need to be improved. The broad scope of IP needs to be better addressed in many of the training programs, and good admin things like preparation, follow up are often missing. So there's some, it's not rocket science, but things definitely need to be improved when it comes to IP education.
Final question from me: the game of IP is played by more than just IP people, right? So this is why the whole education thing is important, because essentially what you're saying is the IP people have got it, but it's about educating the rest of the business so that they can get engaged with and play the IP game. Is that right? Is that where you're coming from on this?
Oh yes. Yeah. Oh yes, primarily it's the non-IP people who need to understand it. But I mean, if we just take an example, if obviously if you're an engineer doing development and research and development, you need to have a sort of understanding of, okay, how does IP relate to the R&D or the technology? If you're a sourcing or procurement person interacting with a supplier, for example, buying in a piece of software, licensing a piece of software, you need to have think about the IP in terms of copyright, maybe open source or whatever. If you're a finance guy or a tax guy in a company, you need to understand, hang on, this is an asset class. What are the costs? What is the valuation? What happens if I'm doing things like transferring the assets between group members into group licenses, transfer pricing? So IP touches everybody. If you're in marketing and you're producing a brochure and you want to have a nice front cover, well, can I just take a photograph from anywhere and use it, or do I have to think about copyright? So IP touches so many different people across an organization. So what we want, we're not expecting that everyone becomes IP experts, but we want each person to have at least a good, sound, basic understanding of what IP is, so they can make informed decisions and they don't do stupid or silly things that causes the company problems then later on.
Yeah, and if they don't understand the different IPs, then it's difficult for them then to protect it.
Yep.
So thank you very much, Donal. Really appreciate that.
Thank you for your inviting me today, and thanks for to listening to my comments. Thank you.
No, thank you, Donal. Thanks everybody. Follow us for the next update installment, Damian, on the LegStech IP protection series. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.